Hello, everyone, and welcome to a brand new episode of the Jams Deeper podcast, where we spin the jams and spill the tea. And this week, we're coming at you with a brand new episode where we're going to talk about some stuff. So there's a bit of a holdover from last year still, because we want to talk about films, because we love film. We've talked about some of our favorite films of
2021
in a sort of separate video end of the year series, and we figured that we can take this new segment of our show to talk about basically anything happening in the world of art and media that we want to discuss. So each of us are going to briefly mention our top 2 films of the year, as well as talking about what we have been listening to this week.
Yeah, so we're still kind of feeling this Now series out, this series that we're releasing each week on Monday, still kind of feeling it out structurally, what it's going to be. But one thing we thought would be cool would be to start each episode off by kind of talking about what's been happening recently in the world of music, bands that have announced new albums, released new singles, or just interesting things that have happened recently. And so I'll kick it off with the new music announcements that have happened this week. It's actually we're in this period of each year in January where you get very few actual albums being released, but you get a lot of album announcements happening. And so the year starts to kind of take form in terms of who are the big artists that are going to be releasing this year, who are the artists that we're interested in that are going to be releasing this year, and we start to get an idea of how all that's going to piece together. And it's quite exciting because our review schedule for February and March in particular is starting to really fill out. So we're going to have some really exciting new release review episodes when those albums drop, which are really excited for. One artist that we have reviewed before, we reviewed their very last album, which came out in 2021. Shushu have a new album coming out called Ignore Grief, which is going to be dropping on the 3rd of March. Released a new single called May Bay Bay Bay, which is some of these song titles on this Shushu album are just like, they're like Shushu song title generator. The Real Chaos, Cha Cha Cha, 666 photos of nothing.
Well,
that's awesome. That rules.
That's a lot of photos.
My personal favorite, Brothel Creeper. And
I'm big on a Dracula Parrot Moon Moth myself.
That's just it's amazing they haven't already made a song called Dracula Parrot Moon Moth, to be honest.
I mean, 3 favorite tracks: Dracula Parrot Moon Moth.
Yeah, the song that mentions Little Richard for whatever reason. Anyway, so it looks like the new Shushu album is going to be
small dick.
Looks like the new Shushu album is going to be some proper Shushu shit, and we're very much looking forward to it. Another artist that announced a new record this year that I'm very excited for is Avey Tare of Animal Collective. We reviewed the last Animal Collective album back around the same time last year, Time Skiffs, and the new Avey Tare album, which is called 7S. For whatever reason, he drops 2 singles together, or like 2 songs together this week, and the album is actually only like 7 songs long, but the songs are quite lengthy. They're sort of psychedelic pop jams. One of them was like 9 minutes long, and so they're very much in that sort of like jammier space that people who enjoyed those sort of more songs like Cherokee and songs that are more spacey on that Animal Collective album, I think we'll probably get a good amount out of this. Avey Tare's solo career, I think, has been improving with each successive release that he's put out. So I'm really excited to see how that album turns out. We also got an announcement this week, very exciting announcement of a new record from M83, a long-awaited new record in a certain sense, because basically the last major M83 album that sort of made waves and that kind of had a conversation around it was 2016's Junk, which was notably, I don't want to say a pivot, because M83 have kind of always been heading in the direction of being this kind of like cheesy 80s pastiche stuff, but they kind of fused that with post-rock on their most beloved album, 2011's Hurry Up We're Dreaming, which is one of my favorite albums ever, and then kind of sort of shedded away that post-rock edge to go for a kind of like Sesame Street vibe with Junk. And that album, it's an album I have complicated feelings about, but a lot of it just doesn't work. We talk a lot about uncool music. this is like beyond the pale uncool. This is like trying to be the least cool thing in the world. And, you know, in the pursuit of that, it finds some really kitschy, fun synth pop jams, but also was just very much an album that just gave people something they weren't really looking for from M83. And then ever since then, it's kind of just been weird ambient discursions. They released the second Digital Shades album in 2019, the sequel to their 2007 ambient record. And it was kind of just, you know, whatever. Anthony Gonzalez, the main guy or the front man, entire band now essentially of M83, did the soundtrack to his brother Jan Gonzalez's sort of queer giallo film Knife Plus Heart as well, which was a pretty interesting and exciting and interesting film. But really there hasn't been any proper actual music from M83 in a long time. So they announced a new record called Fantasy. In true M83 fashion, the album cover looks terrible. They have a history of just bad album covers. They're just really
every choice that was made here was
there's
wrong.
Like only 4 choices to be made on with this album cover,
and they're all so wrong.
Based on the single anyway, Ocean's Niagara, it looks like they're finally getting back to territory that people who are big fans of records like Hurry Up We're Dreaming are going to be more into. There's more of that kind of sugar rush shoegaze pop sound. It's still not quite there yet. The teaser, the lead single feels a little bit more like maybe it's teasing towards something bigger. Although who knows, maybe the whole record will kind of be more in that instrumental vein. But it's a big album, 66 minutes long. It's going to be a proper M83 release by the looks of it. And I, for one, am really excited, to be honest, because I've really wanted this band to head back towards the things that make them so strong, which is this kind of larger than life, huge shoegaze pop sound with tinges of emo in there that I fell in love with as a preteen, basically, and dictated so much of my music listening. So we'll see what that turns out like. One of the most high-profile releases of the week, at least, you know, as far as I'm concerned anyway, a big deal. It was something that I actually talked about in this episode last week that I was anticipating but hadn't happened yet. And then as soon as I released that episode, basically the announcement happens. We are, of course, getting a new album from the legendary down-tempo by way of sophistopop act Everything But the Girl, their first new album in 24 years. It's dropping in April. It's going to be called Fuse, and they released a single as well, Nothing Left to Lose, which sees them going in a very interesting direction, which is it's kind of this UK garage 2-step burial adjacent dubstep thing that I find really fascinating as a direction for Everything But the Girl. It's simultaneously surprising and also kind of makes perfect sense considering that what they were most influenced by in their late 90s era was UK dance music trends, essentially. But kind of along the more sort of sleeker nocturnal side of those sorts of things. And it's like, though we've moved on by 25 years, they aesthetically have kind of moved on only by 10 years or so. And they're kind of doing these trends that were really popular in the late 2000s. And so it's a really intriguing direction for Everything But the Girl. It took me a few listens to figure out how I felt about this song, execution-wise, but I have come around on it. I think that it's the biggest thing I can say in its favor is that production-wise, it sounds really good. It sounds sleek. It sounds modern. It sounds polished in a way that I think does make it feel like Everything But the Girl have matured and are making new music essentially, as opposed to just picking up from where they left off. So that I'm particularly looking forward to. And in the world of metal as well, we had a particularly curious announcement that August, I think you can tell us about.
Yes. So legendary, in fact, genre-defining gent band Periphery have announced their 7th album, Periphery 5. Gent is not a genre. Now,
Fuck
Periphery,
off. That is not what it's called.
That is the name of the album.
Absolutely what it is called. Periphery are, of course, a divisive act within the world of metal.
Divisive, the gent.
Certainly important in the sound and aesthetic they helped to develop, but how well that aesthetic actually works for you is certainly up for debate. Many people find it a little obnoxious and unlistenable, overproduced. But personally, I think Periphery have a way where they can pull like I think their first album pulls off their sound really well. Their second album is fairly well executed too, and from there on out it gets a little more patchy. But with this album announcement have come 2 singles, Wildfire and Zagreus. I mean,
Sure, why not? I mean, this is also a band whose last 2 albums were called Select Difficulty and the amazing Hail Stan.
One sec, hey, we have to talk about. I've heard both of the singles to this album, so we're talking about these two, and they sound like Periphery songs. I can say that much. I'm not terribly impressed with the showing here, but it's also not terrible.
Look, every time I hear about Gent, even though I've barely even tested the waters of that genre, I kind of start getting a little bit of a headache. But just looking at Periphery's discography, I have to say, I have to give these guys credit for their sense of humor. I somehow completely missed that their second album is called Periphery 2. This time it's
yeah.
Which is
so
amazing, objectively fantastic thing to call your second album.
Frankly, I think the sense of humor is a lot of what carries Periphery for me, is that even within their very singular vision of metal, I still think they still manage to have like fun and fuck around and just be a little goofy characters. So I don't terribly mind it myself.
Yeah. So, look, we'll see how that shakes out. August, I'm sure you'll be able to let us know regardless, once it releases, of where it fits in the Periphery canon and in the wider world of Gent in general. Maybe someday we'll do a Gent video of some description or Retro Club or something. Who knows? It feels like everything that we say, that we're either divided on or that we hate in some way, we end up doing a video on. So we'll see what happens there. So that's it for album announcements this week. There may be other album announcements that I haven't touched on. If so, and they mean something to you, let me know in the comments. But we had a few singles that dropped this week as well that I want to shout out separately. We haven't had a formal album announcement yet, but we finally got the lead single to the follow-up to Parannoul's To See the Next Part of the Dream, an album that I have been anticipating so much. I can't remember what the name of the album is. I think it's After the Magic or something like that. We got a new single from Parannoul this week. We Shine at Night. It is, to be honest, it's fucking gorgeous. Like, no surprise here. Like, Parannoul is amazing, right? We love Parannoul. We've been consistently a fan of not only his albums, but also the songs that he contributes to side projects as well. When I talked about my favorite EPs of the year last month, I shouted out Paraglow, the EP that he did with Asian Glow, which to me signified that he had lost none of the exciting ambition that made him so awesome on those 2021 releases. But yeah, this new song is fucking gorgeous. Not only does it sound like Parannoul is expanding his sound and moving into a direction that feels like IMAX scale, it also feels like it's staying true to the spirit of what makes Parannoul such a unique artist, as well as even sounding like this motherfucker has a budget, maybe, because this thing sounds fucking gorgeous. Like, if the intense
it would not surprise me if they got if with the traffic that Longinus Records has been seeing, that they've upped some production qualities, certainly with some other releases we've seen from them this year.
Yeah, for sure. If the intense compression of To See the Next Part of the Dream was something that put you off that a little bit, I know that some people struggle to get into that record because of that. Check out this new song, because it might be exactly what you're looking for from this artist. I absolutely adore it. I think it's the best single of the year so far. Also worth noting as well, we've been eagerly awaiting, and Morgan shouted out last week as well, that we've got a new Paramore record coming very soon, and they released a new song from it this week as well. Comme c'est, comme ça. Comme c'est, comme ça. No, 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 no. This song is just catchy as hell. It's very much in the same tribute. It's very much in the same vein as This Is Why and The News, the two singles they've already dropped. I'll be honest, I've only heard the song once, And the whole thing is imprinted in my brain. It is that catchy. It's that hooky. You can totally see how they're taking influence from post-punk revival indie bands. They've already shouted out Block Party. I can hear that. I can hear a little bit of a few other bands from that era as well in the song, even a little bit of like Franz Ferdinand, for instance. Other stuff coming through here as influences. It sounds great. Paramore are completely on track. They have not lost a single step. I'm so excited for the new album. We also had a new song this week from Lil Ugly Mane called Ricochet. He has been releasing, he shows no signs of wanting to release a new album anytime soon. He's just been releasing loose singles. He's released about 10 of them in a row now over the past like half year. And they're brilliant, and they showcase very different sides of his sound as well. This new one, Ricochet, is like full on pivot into indie folk. Like none of the sort of psychedelic or vaguely hip hop production stuff that you might be familiar with him for are really present here. This is a full on indie folk song. It sounds great. It's not my favorite one of the solo tracks that he's dropped in this sort of streak, but considering that he basically all of the social media, posting that he's done or anything, all the news we've heard from him has been kind of worrying and not very positive. It's just a relief, honestly, to me, whenever he does release something, because it shows that he's still active and being creative. And that is a positive thing. And I hope that he is in a good place, or he's able to get to a good place, because anyone who's a fan of him knows that the stuff he's posted and the news that's come from his camp in terms of, he's obviously been publicly really struggling with an alcohol addiction. So hopefully he's in a good place right now. Certainly the music is great, and it's been great to see him still releasing. Hopefully we get more from him soon, and hopefully he continues to just be good and be out there and be doing well. Been a busy week for new announcements and releases, and hopefully we'll get to cover a lot of these in a more extended format when the albums themselves release. But there's also been a few interesting things that have happened in the news this week. We obviously had the Golden Globes this week, and obviously more related to TV and stuff. But we had the song Natu Natu from Triple R, that film, won the Best Song Golden Globe. I haven't seen that. Have either of you seen Triple R yet? That seems like something I really need to see. It's a very sort of massive sensation thing that's happened. And interestingly, another film I haven't seen, but I'm very much looking forward to seeing, the score for the Golden Globe for Best Score was given to Justin Hurwitz for Babylon, which is a movie that seems to be generating massive amounts of divisive discourse. That means I am very much intrigued to see how that turns out. My favorite piece of random news from this week is that Marjorie Taylor Greene, the politician from the US, has been beefing with Dr. Dre. And this is just one of those... This is one of those like pure Mad Libs headlines that I just absolutely adore. So what happens is she released a promo video soundtracked by Dr. Dre's classic Still Dre, the immortal song. And and Dr. Dre put out a statement saying that I don't license my music to politicians. This is especially to anyone as divisive and hateful as this person. And and essentially
the most passive aggressive cease and desist letter I've ever read in my life. It's so funny.
Yeah, and what actually eventually happened is that she kind of I think just didn't really respond to this very much. Like her PR person released a statement that was, it was actually kind of like a bit snarky, where it's like, while I appreciate the creative chord progression, I would never play your words of violence against women and police officers and your glorification of the thug life and drugs. So basically she said, actually, I wasn't playing your song. I was playing a similar chord progression or whatever. And then essentially what happened was that she got locked out of her Twitter account for copyright for I guess posting a video of the thing. And eventually she basically folded and said, okay, we will no longer use the song. So that's just one of the most bizarre things to happen this week in the history of Republican politicians essentially getting told off by musical figures. And it's like when it happens with people like Springsteen,
it's a storied tradition in America.
Yeah, it's just particularly funny when it happens with someone like Dr. Dre to me.
Oh yeah, absolutely.
And yeah, we also had, in terms of lighter fare, we had the front man of legendary Kentucky rock outfit, Cage the Elephant, was arrested on gun charges this week, which was certainly a thing that happened. To me, like, I know that these bands aren't really all that similar, but to me, the first thing I thought of when I saw this article is I thought of how, like, Mumford and Sons had to fire their banjo player for being like an avowed alt-right defender of like Andy No, and they eventually ended up going on like a press tour together. And this isn't the same sort of thing. Like Cage the Elephant aren't like a folk band. They're like, but I just love this story so much. He was arrested for illegal gun possession, and the report was that police found the guns in his hotel room in Manhattan, and they found the guns themselves along with like a stream of Polaroids of the guns and these weird deranged notes that this Cage the Elephant singer Matthew Schultz had written, one of which stated, "I will protect myself if I am attacked." So while I don't wish, it certainly looks...
Am I insane, or does this sound like a setup? Like, I'm not trying to be all conspiracy theorist here, but this is like, if I want to blame someone, or if I want to get someone arrested, putting a bunch of guns in their hotel room and basically a note that says, like, I am going to use these.
Well, yeah, like, you know what? There's certainly, I don't want to make fun of Schultz's mental health or anything like that if this is the product of a psychotic break.
No.
But still, there's something, I agree, there's maybe something suspicious here. Maybe this is a setup, to be honest. Or maybe there actually is just no rest for the wicked. So yeah, that is the latest news in terms of the world of Kentucky artists. The only reliable of whom now seem to be country or folk artists, to be honest. You can't trust any rock band that hails from Kentucky, unfortunately.
No.
So yeah. But anyway, Melophobia is still pretty good album. I did listen to the first couple of songs on that. Spiderhead, Come a Little Closer, they still hit. I hope that Mr. Elephant gets all the help he needs. And in the slightly more somber news as well, it feels like we might need to have a segment every week specifically for deaths, because this is getting ridiculous.
Yeah, in Memoriam.
It's getting really, really ridiculous. So we lost two major figures in the world of music and music adjacent entertainment, I guess.
What is this life shit? People just die. It's like, what the fuck?
And it was particularly tragic to lose Lisa Marie Presley this week. Particularly because of the fact that this was a couple of days after Austin Butler won at the Golden Globes for his amazing performance as Elvis in the self-titled film.
I think what's equally unfortunate about this is it seems from what reports have suggested that she succumbed to the same heart ailments many of her relatives have.
Yeah.
It's just a shame, honestly. I mean, it fucking sucks.
August, not to really ruin that moment or anything, but I love you trying your hardest to be earnest and serious and solemn while you have that picture.
The Iron Sheik.
Iron Sheik right behind you.
Yeah.
If you haven't followed the Iron Sheik's Twitter account, go do that.
He's awesome. He's so good.
But yeah, just to continue our little in memoriam segment here as well, another huge loss this week. We lost Jeff Beck, one of the most legendary guitarists of all time, obviously most known for his seminal period in the mid-60s with the Yardbirds, that period where they released their biggest records, like their self-titled album, and of course having a rave up as well. Jeff Beck is one of the most integral people to the history of the modern electric guitar, along with Hendrix, along with Clapton, along with basically anyone you can name from that era. So while of course Jeff Beck did thankfully live a fairly long and successful life, it still is a shame to have to say goodbye to him so suddenly like this. And if anything, I owe it to myself as well to revisit not only his seminal work with the Yardbirds, which I'm vaguely familiar with song-wise from my childhood, but also to give myself an excuse to listen to some of his solo work as well. The thing about Jeff Beck, from what I can gather, is that not only is he one of the most seminal guitarists in terms of advancing rock and roll from the 60s, but he's also a person who did not stay stagnant as well and moved away from the initial, rock and roll sound and blues adjacent rock of the 60s, moved into the world of jazz rock as well, continued evolving his sound and his skill set as well, and truly being this sort of restless figure who essentially continued to innovate as much as he could throughout his career. So yeah, big tribute from the Jams and Tea podcast to Jeff Beck as well. Tremendous loss. Well, that basically brings us to the present day, what we've been listening to recently. Jake, is there anything you want to shout out artist or album wise from the last week that you have taken to or otherwise feel is worth a mention?
Well, something that's definitely worth a mention is that, here on the Jams and Tea podcast, I like to think that we are vocal advocates of weird music, just music that challenges general, conventions, music that breaks boundaries, music that goes against maybe your initial listening sensibilities. So I think that it's notable when I say that I may have heard the strangest album I've ever heard in my life this week. This came from a band that I've just sort of put on the back burner just because I've downloaded lots of interesting music over the last, year or so. And I finally got around to it. And this is the band, amusingly titled The Legendary Pink Dots. And this is a band that have been active since the early 80s up until now. They are an incredibly prolific band who have made I want to say 70 albums over the course of the last 40 years. And I've seen the sort of frontman of the group who is amusingly named, or at least goes by, Edward Caspel. Ha! He is referred to in several comments as the Alejandro Jodorowsky of music.
That sounds awesome.
After listening to their 1990 album, The Crushed Velvet Apocalypse, I can certainly see why that is the case.
Amazing album title.
Absolutely. It's got an amazing album cover as well. And that's what initially drew me to it. And of course, it's got the neo-psychedelic tag on it. And I'm like, okay, this should be interesting. And what follows is 70 minutes of... Let me put it to you like this. The first song on this album is very current 93, which I think is a lot of the default for this band. I would say is very similar. Even the lead singer has a voice that's very similar to David Tibet. It's just that he's British instead. And there is spoken word, but there is a lot more singing, and it is very neo-folky, soundscapey kind of stuff. And it's this very eerie kind of ominous song that's I can only describe it as if David Tibet wrote Radiohead's Creep. And then after that, you get songs like Hellsville, which is a psychedelic noise track that sounds like it has the backing beat to the Macarena in it, the electronic version of the Macarena. And it's a little bit slower. And when I say that this album is the strangest I've ever heard, when we talk about weird albums, we usually talk about albums like Mr. Bungle, stuff that's really assaultive, that's really overwhelming and fast-paced and hits you and just kind of disorients you. And this isn't that. All of its ideas are fairly coherent in and of themselves, but every single song on this album is completely unlike the other. The second song on here, Green Gang, is a lot of Eastern instruments are being used, and it is very folky, psychedelic sort of stuff. But then there's a track on here called The Pleasure Palace, which is I mean, I don't even know how to describe this shit, man. This is this depraved, Ween-esque kind of just like electronic song that is this really garish, disgusting, very purposefully silly but also disturbing recount of sexual indulgence. I would also like to point out that I listened to an EP from this band that's called Faces in the Fire. It's not a very good EP, but it does have a song about an industrial dildo on it, and I can only describe it as being like the song on White Light, White Heat. That's the story about Waldo getting his head cut off, but it also
Spoiler
has
alert.
2 minutes of it also has 2 minutes of a British man and a British woman just like moaning loudly, and it's certainly something. I can certainly say that it was something I've never experienced before. And look, all I'm telling you is that if you're interested in music that is challenging, music that is strange, music that is weird, you owe it to yourself to explore some of the highlights of this band. I'm not even necessarily sure how much I like the Crushed Velvet Apocalypse. It's a very diverse album. I enjoyed all of it on like a singular level. I'm not really sure how it all comes together at the moment. I'll have to re-listen to it again, but it is a whole lot. I think the only person I could confidently recommend this to is actually August, just because as a curiosity, I feel like you will. I'm not sure how much you'll even like this album. I just know that you will find it fascinating.
I mean,
plan
your description alone has done wonders for me in convincing me to check this out. So I will assuredly be hearing this sometime this year.
The other thing I'm going to mention is that I listened to an album from a band that Ryley has talked about since basically the very inception of this podcast, which is the sophistopop band Prefab Sprout. And we talked about this when we talked about Sade, is that Ryley was looking forward to me getting into my sophistopop era. And what prompted this is also a friend of the podcast, Spencer, released his 100 favorite albums list. And this landed on that list particularly highly, I believe. And so I was just like, I should listen to a couple of these. And this was one of the albums that I listened to. And upon first listen, hell yes. I was very into this. I basically described it as this is Born in the USA era Bruce Springsteen meets like, I don't know, they do have a kind of classier, smoother, kind of cooler edge, which I didn't really expect just because they have such a dork ass name, Prefab Sprout. But their music is so slick and so effortlessly cool that it doesn't really come across, I guess, aesthetically speaking, especially because you look at the album cover and you look at all these guys with their incredibly 1980s hair. But there's kind of a Replacements sort of Tim jangle pop edge to the sound here too that's just excellent. I listened to the remaster of this, which I'm sure had something to do with my appreciation for the sonic elements of this, but like I listened to this basically every day since I heard it, and I liked it even more each time I heard it. Like even the more slight moments on the record appealed to me more and more. Like particularly underrated songs on there, like Moving the River and Horsing Around, are just so immaculately written, like to the point where I would say this is like the sophistopop Pet Sounds. Everything on here is so dense, so slick, so shiny and amazing. I mean, you've got, of course, like standouts like the opener, Fair and Young, one of the best pop songs I've ever heard, Bonnie. And then there's stuff like When Love Breaks Down or Appetite, which just everything on here is so emotionally complex, and you end up like unexpectedly relating to a lot of the material here, like you would on an album like Tim by the Replacements, an album I listened to over the break, by the way, and became one of my favorite albums ever. But even stuff like Desire As or When the Angels, The Closer, everything
Lucille,
on
number
here.
one.
Yes, Goodbye Lucille, number one. And like just everything on here is stellar. And I also have to shout out the vocal performances on here. Patty McAloon, every voice that contributes to this, both backing vocals and the primary singer, are fan fucking tastic melodies that you will get stuck in your head forever. And there are moments on this where motherfucker will just like scream at the end of a song and you're just like, whoa,
well,
holy shit.
Here's the thing that's awesome about, and I think this is something that's true of all the best sophistopop bands and like the yacht rock 70s tradition that this is rooted in as well, is that, yeah, it's incredibly slick and smooth music where melodies and just really honed songwriting are really pushed to the forefront. But the best vocalists don't sound like, you know, one-dimensional, or don't sound like they're doing this kind of dream pop thing. The best vocalists have an edge to them, right? That gives this whole thing a counterpoint that complements it and makes it feel so much even more, you know, sort of it has even more depth, right? So Paddy's voice is fantastic. He can scratch, he can really reach the limits of his register and make it sound fantastic.
A great rock vocalist.
Absolutely, right? And he's also like, he's very much a Brian Wilson figure, right? He's not just this band's singer and frontman. He is this visionary songwriter. He brought the band together. He had this idea for who they were, and he made them pursue that. And he was the vision through it the entire time. You know, you listening to this prompted me to revisit it, and it's an amazing record. I just had the time of my life. And then Connor was wanting to get into this band as well. And so me and Connor like simultaneously listened to their debut album, which came before this, which is a little bit weirder, a little bit more sort of adventurous and experimental, but still has that same pop core. And this is the thing that's great about Prefab Sprout, is every single album they make, they do something slightly different with their sound. They tweak it in some ways. They emphasize some elements over others. They do something, but that core quality of songwriting, of catchiness, of just pure, you know, melted butter smoothness to the whole sound of it all is always there. And a big part of that as well is their frequent collaborations with producer Thomas Dolby, who's just one of the greatest producers of the 80s. He produced this. He produced, I think he didn't produce their follow-up from Langley Park to Memphis in full. I think he produced part of it, but that record sounds amazing as well. That's like this, but just more synth focused and just really kind of colorful and sort of IMAX scale. And then he produced what I think is their kind of grand, messy, but still opus masterpiece, 1990s Jordan the Comeback, which is, I think, the best sounding pop record maybe ever. I mean, the way that record sounds is like, it ruins other music for you. It genuinely does. And I think Steve McQueen is basically almost at that level as well. It is their most beloved record for a good reason. It is the most just honed and absolutely accessible and fun side of Prefab Sprout. The A side is virtually immaculate. I'm so stoked you've gotten into this band. I think, you know, I'm glad that recommendation led to something that you really connected with, and I'm sure you'll find your way from here into your own sort of little, you know, journey through this world of music as well.
I've downloaded all the remasters. I can't wait to give those like really lauded records a shot, just because, I mean, this is such, Jordan especially is an interesting prospect. I think I'm going to go back sort of in order through the band, but I want to see what their double album masterpiece ends up being like, just because that's such a tantalizing prospect.
Well, it's a really cool record because it takes a couple of listens because it is quite long. But the whole thing with that record is that like it's split into 4 quarters, and each quarter of the album is like Paddy writing about a very specific thing. Like the first quarter is like just straightforward pop bangers, and it's just him trying to write the best pop bangers he can. In the second quarter is like all songs about Elvis. And then the third quarter is something completely different. And the fourth quarter is like this sort of songs about death and all this sort of stuff. So the whole album has this kind of cool sort of like arc where each different segment of it is a focus on a different thing, and it takes you on this cool journey. But yeah, you know, Paddy's a great writer like that.
Elvis really did embody peanut butter jelly time.
Whatever that means, I agree.
No, I mean, I'm serious. He had the peanut butter and jelly sandwiches with the bananas on them, like the banana in that video, making him the purest peanut butter jelly timer of all time.
Yeah, so there's loads of great Prefab Sprout records you can check out. I think
loads
you'll have a
of great
time with-
Elvis sandwiches you can eat with 2 peanut butter and 1 bacon, or 2 bananas and 1 bacon.
Even. Yeah. Mm-hmm. Well, moving it along then. August, was there anything you wanted to shout it out from your listening this week?
Yeah, a couple things. 2, in fact, because that's what we're doing. One release I got to was from one Mr. Pharoah Sanders, that being Black Unity.
I listened to this as well.
I listened to it because you did, and we can have a little conversation now. Clever like this. After our discussion last week on Sonny Chirac, I really wanted to probe a bit deeper into his discography because I've only heard Karma, and I felt that was a mistake that needed to be amended. So I listened to Black Unity, and this album's awesome. I love. It does one of my favorite tropes of like Pharoah Sanders' music, is that he'll make these giant songs where he has like this core idea that he keeps iterating on until it becomes this almost unrecognizable from its original form, but still just like close enough to that it lands really well. Like, this record starts out in an almost like down tempo kind of ambient place, and it kind of ends there too, but it builds to this very overwhelming, fulsome, and just hard hitting record. I cannot say I was terribly familiar with any of the non Pharoah Sanders players on this record from like other things they did, but I assume they're all competent. Well, I don't assume they are. I fucking listened to it. That was the
meanest thing you could have possibly said.
I was gonna say
I listened to this great album. I assume everyone on it was competent.
Pharoah Sanders, he did well. The rest of you were like, you were here. I mean, you got a paycheck. This record rules. It's one like on streaming has amended it to be like one big 37-minute song. It's a really consistently engaging experience. Of course, Pharoah Sanders on the tenor sax is just insane. There's some just screaming, crushing moments, especially as you get really deep into this. It's exactly what you would want out of like a Pharoah Sanders kind of avant-garde, like, I don't know, spiritual thing. It's really cool. You should check it out, even if the performers on it who aren't Pharoah Sanders suck.
I have to agree.
Terrible.
They're fucking.
I have to agree with August on his assessment. Is that I thought this was absolutely wonderful. There were points where this certainly feels more untethered than Karma does. The free jazz element feels a little bit more pronounced. The improvisational aspects feel a bit more pronounced, and there's a bit more diversity in instrumentation as well. Like there's a really pronounced harmonium element on here that just like really inhabits part of the mix for like the central sort of like 20 minutes of this album. And it's a pretty short record. I think it's 35 minutes overall. It's just the one kind of piece. And just throughout it, the way it just sort of builds and then sustains that energy that's just like physically overwhelming. It feels like your headphones are going to like overheat when you're listening to this. And it feels
I simply did not listen to this on headphones for that reason.
Yeah, like I did listen to it on headphones, and it was like, whoa, holy shit. And I kind of recommend it. And I gotta say, I think that of the albums where Pharoah Sanders, that I've heard at least, where I've heard his most recent album, the collaboration with the London Symphony Orchestra, and what is that other artist that Floating Points, yes, thank you. I heard that. I've heard Karma and his collaborative record with Alice Coltrane, Journey to Satchidananda. Of all of those projects, I actually think that Black Unity is my favorite, just because it feels like I mean, yes, it is the most rawly impressive, but it was the experience that I feel like I got the most out of. Like, re-listening to this was a particularly interesting prospect, just because you get to explore like the different aspects of it. If you can track down the remaster of this specifically, I would highly recommend that, just because you get a lot out of isolating what each of the performers are doing, contrary to our joke of everyone being only competent. But everyone on here is genuinely very sensational. Like, it's very easy to sort of focus on Pharoah Sanders as the centerpiece, sort of focal point of the project, and he is certainly like the most overwhelming,
he is certainly the guiding
presence
voice here, I would say.
Oh yes, most definitely.
And one more thing I'll shout out from last year, actually, that I listened to recently, from MJ Lenderman, Boat Songs.
Yes.
MJ Lenderman is the guitarist of a band called Wednesday that I'm not familiar with them, but I listened to this at the behest of my father, and
Dads love this. Like,
what a sentence.
This is Stephen Hayden's album of 2022, tied with the Big Thief record.
Okay, that makes
and it's
sense.
just like, it's the kind of record that just dads everywhere adore this thing.
Yeah, and it's got this great blend of like country rock and also like psychedelic slacker rock, almost like King Tuff, I would say. I was thinking of him a lot during this. But yeah, it's just this really tight album of these 10 songs. I'd say the middle is kind of whatever, but I think the bookends here are just phenomenal. I love those first 4 songs, and the last 3 are also really good.
You Are Every Girl to Me and Taste Just Like It Costs. Those songs.
Taste Just Like It Costs. That one.
The guitar playing on those songs is unreal. He's just fucking locked in. And also shout out to You've Bought Yourself a Boat, which is just one of the catchiest songs this year. Last year.
I really love I love the opener Hangover Game. I think the
song.
double on the kind of pun of that whole song is really cute and funny. TLC Cage Match is another one I really enjoy, and just the desolate hellscape that is Six Flags at the end of this album is really crushing and cool.
It's like a 33-minute album as well. It's just really
so
just
in and out, and it's just like,
so there's a song called Toontown on it.
Yeah. You know, it's the thing Maximilian Pegasus used to beat Kaiba.
But the weakest stuff on this record, I would say, only makes up about 6 minutes of its 33.
And that's the benefit of it, that it's so like
really strong.
Even if the hook to like Under Control is a little generic, I still like the song. It's still nice. Yeah, I mean, at its worst, I think it's nice. At its best, it's pretty darn good. So yeah, this gets a huge shout from me. I really enjoyed this.
Yeah, it's just one of those records where, because I've had this experience with so many albums recently, it's like it starts off really strong. Like those first 3 or 4 songs, as you say, are fantastic. And I'm like, oh shit, is this going to be like a sleeper, masterpiece or something that's going to kind of slip under the radar and just be something that I become obsessed with? And then it's like, oh, he starts taking his foot off the gas a little bit in the midsection, and it's not bad, but it's like, oh no, this is going to be the point where it's like you've just become so clear that all the best material was just put right at the start. And so I get into that mindset when this starts to happen of like, oh man, I got my hopes up, and then the last 3 songs of this album hit, and then like, it is like nothing you've ever heard. It is just brilliant. And it's like, and then it's the kind of thing where, it's not a perfect album, but it's like the whole arc of it almost makes me appreciate it more as a whole. Like the way that it kind of ebbs and flows and lets those final few songs really just land with this heft. Not necessarily always musically, but certainly emotionally. It just feels like, especially with the lyrics to a song like You're Every Girl to Me as well, just completely break my heart. Like that song is just so crushing to me. I just like
it's
the passage where he's like, I bought you a shirt from the local merch at the airport, gave it to you and screamed, You Are Every Girl to Me.
Screamed, You Are Every Girl to Me. That, and I I love like the kind of up tempo kind of guitar part behind that. It's really nice. It comes together in such a fun way.
Yeah, he has this
Yeah.
great way of like writing songs as well, where like the entire lyric to the song will just be one continuous sort of like not story necessarily, but scene that he's setting. Like Taste Just Like It Costs.
It's just broken up over these very sparse verses.
Mm.
And I think that's something I did enjoy about it, how reserved and sparse it could be lyrically, while letting just the tone of the music and some of those very classic country rock swoons just really carry you through this. It reminds me a lot of some of the best work of like Graham Parsons almost, with its own edge, of course.
Yeah. It's just got everything. It's got darkness, it's got emotionality, it's got structural like satisfaction in terms of the way it hits home at the end, and it's got a sense of humor to it, which is probably the biggest sort of element that I like as well.
Like the mothballs line on the "you bought yourself a boat." Yeah. I love all of the minor inconveniences on that song. They're also like quaint and just relatable in a way of like, oh god damn it, I know what you're talking about. I know what this is.
Yeah, absolutely. And there's just like random, like I love a songwriter who can write in quite a simple way and communicate emotions that are very palpable and easy to understand, but also kind of make you feel uncomfortable and don't feel like complete. Like an SUV, that whole thing about the song being, whereas like, I still have the key to your boyfriend's SUV. Like, why on earth would he have that? It makes no sense. And yet by the end of the song, I feel like you've understood this coherent, emotional state that he's in of, disconnection from this past relationship, but also a lack of resolution to it. It's just, he's a really good writer. Good album.
Yeah. How about yourself, Ryley? What have you? Well, what do you want to shout out? What are you bringing to the fore? Present to us.
Yeah, I could see you were heading in a more threatening direction as you were speaking there. Well, I've listened to a fair amount this week. Not a lot that's massively standing out in my mind. One album that I revisited that I hadn't listened to in several years, a classic from the world of soul music. I listened to Isaac Hayes' Hot Buttered Soul, absolutely brilliant soul record, one of the most like progressive albums in the history of soul music. It came at the tail end of the 60s and did what was quite a revolutionary thing for soul music at the time, which was essentially it's covering standards more or less. Like there's I think there's three sort of standards that Isaac covers on this, and then the fourth song is an original, but it's just 4 tracks and 40 minutes. And what he does with these standards is he takes these 3-minute pop songs or 3-minute R&B songs or whatever, and he just turns them into the fucking sexiest funk soul jam you ever heard in your life. Walk On By, the version, I think it's a Burt Bacharach song originally, but it's been covered so many times. But Walk On By, the first track here, is just peerless. Like, you listen to this, you've heard it before, whether you know it or not. You've heard this version of it, you've heard any cover of it. But man, the atmosphere, the groove that he lays down here is just, you listen to it and you dare not fucking blink. It's just that locked in. It's so good. And that's the thing, is it's like, it's not an album that's, intense in any way. Like, it's very atmospheric. And that was one of the things that was super revolutionary about it, was that Isaac was taking his fucking time, right? And it was an example, like, as artists like, Marvin Gaye, for instance, would go on to do, it was an example of like, it took a lot for artists in the world of soul to actually get proper creative control wrested from labels. But when they did, they almost invariably made records like this that completely changed the language of the genre. And you have the original song on here, Hyperbolic Syllabic Sesquidellamistic, which is one of the most like...
Excuse me?
I posted on Twitter about this song because it's just so fucking funny. The bit for this song is that Isaac is basically in love with this woman, or the sex with this woman is so good, essentially, that he's able to conjure an entirely new vocabulary when he's trying to describe her. Like, I'm going to read you the lyrics here. I want to come back because I like it like that. Your modus operandi is really all right, out of sight. Your sweet phalanges know how to squeeze my gastronomical stupidity. I'm really satisfied when you're loving me.
I don't know about the gastronomical line.
I posted that lyric, like, your sweet phalanges know how to squeeze my gastronomical stupidity, on Twitter, and immediately I got a reply saying Isaac here is communicating that he is into butt stuff. And the song goes on like this. And by the way, when I read these lyrics, you have to understand, he's not singing them in my fucking nasal voice. He's singing them real slow and sexy. And it sounds like, when I say that, it sounds like it shouldn't work, but I swear it does. He goes on.
No, instead he sings it in the voice of Chef from South Park.
I can't sleep at night, but that's all right. The MD tells me my heart's on strike. Originating from a lover's asphyxiation. I better slow down before you drive me in the ground. But what he doesn't know is I want another encore. Now what I say, hyperbolic, syllabic, sesquidellamistic. Let me stop procrastinating, standing here and narrating. Find my emancipator. She's a love educator. Cerebral cerebellum, a medulla oblongata. He just goes on like this, and he makes it sound like amazing. And you've got to understand, like, as well, all the while this is happening, you're getting some of the slickest keys. There's a piano solo on this track that's like one of the greatest piano solos I've ever heard, right up there with Jules Holland's piano solo on Thar's Uncertain Smile. This is one of the great ones. You don't often get to talk about great piano solos, but they do exist. And then, of course, you get the infamous closer, By the Time I Get to Phoenix. Classic cover as well. Has this 8-minute intro, spoken word intro, where Isaac is going to setting up, it's basically Isaac talking about when a man loves a woman, and he gets a certain type of way. And he just does this whole thing for like 8 minutes straight, where he's just riffing about how, being in lust fucks with your mind or whatever. And then when the song finally starts, this is an 18-minute track, by the way. First half of it is spoken word. And then the song finally starts, and it's just, I can't describe this album without like literally embarrassing myself. It's just a classic for good reason. It's impossible to listen to this record and not feel like the coolest motherfucker in the world. No wonder he made this and then immediately went on to make the score for Shaft. Like, come on. The man was on a roll.
I just wanted to talk very briefly about I've only heard 3 albums new this year. I'm trying to stay on top of new releases pretty tightly, but this is a sort of, the January malaise where not a whole lot has come out so far. So I'm just kind of trawling through the Rate Your Music charts. And one thing that I came across is an artist called Cora's Heart, who only has 2 albums, 2 projects so far that like nobody has paid that much attention to. But her newest album, Anima, which is a post-metal Blackgaze, just like very atmospheric black metal electronic record that, of the 3 albums I've heard so far this year, this one is my favorite. But I have some drawbacks with it, but it has enough material that I really wanted to shout it out and recommend it. It is also a really tight 40-minute long record, and it is from an obscure artist who I think deserves a little bit more love, just because I want to see this project grow a little bit, because this is a really fascinating combination of instruments. There is a lot of really great synthesizer. This also has like shit like a theremin on it. It has horns all over it. There is like, for a Blackgaze album especially, that's like, from what I assume is basically a bedroom album, this has an incredible amount of instrumental diversity. Now, that's not to say all of this works. I think the horns in particular sound a bit stiff, and there are some great, properly amazing post-metal Blackgaze songs on here, like the 5th song on here, In Existencia, which is probably my front runner for the best song I've heard all year so far, which is where all of the elements of this album really come together. A lot of really great electronic textures, a lot of really great guitar work, some really great screamed vocals. But then there are other moments on here, like maybe the closer, for instance, where some of the colliding ideas and textures aren't as skillfully employed. All of it feels a little bit rudimentary. It feels like not a lot of it coheres together. And some of the songs on here will have really like excellent segments and progressions, and then some of them will go into places that I find a little less compelling, and then at the very end of the song it'll go back into something cool again. So regardless of where you fall down on projects like this, I think this has enough material to get you interested in where this project could be going. But like, for people who like projects like the Longinus like label stuffs, particularly Sonhos Tomom Kanta, if you liked Maladaptive Daydreaming last year, I think this is very much in that like stead, but it's not so much overshadowed by that sound. Like, this really does feel like they're sort of paving their own way with this project. So give this a listen. It's a very interesting project. It's not a great album, but it could lead to a great album in the future, if you get what I mean.
Absolutely. Great shout out. I'm glad we can continue flying the flag for this particular bedroom. I'm just going to call it bed gaze because I like the way that sounds. But it's
That's
cool.
good.
It's cool that those artists are still out there. A lot of them probably very undiscovered. So yeah, absolutely want to fly the flag for that. The second album I want to shout out is an album that's come to mean a lot to me very recently. It is definitely I've only heard 2 albums that have come out this year so far, but it's my favorite of the 2. And not for lack of competition either, because I do think this is a genuinely great record. It is admittedly a record that is at the juncture of a particular kind of emo that I'm particularly fond of. And that is the sort of brand of emo that is in the vein of artists like Foxing, specifically like Near My God and Draw Down the Moon era Foxing, and like later era Manchester Orchestra as well. I described it as kind of a fusion of those 2 bands. It's from a Mississippi-based former pop-punk band essentially called Fireworks, who released a string of moderately successful, but mostly kind of just under the radar pop punk albums in the late 2000s and early 2010s. And then with the most successful of those, 2014's Oh Common Life, they kind of just backed away after that. And this is them back. This is their first album in 9 years. It's called Higher Lonely Power. And there's a number of reasons why this album has really struck me. First of all, it feels very much, again, like the latest album in the lineage of records like Near My God, of records even like stuff from the Hotelier and some of those more sort of obscure 4th to 5th wave, or 4th wave, I guess, emo bands who are incorporating a lot more influence from indie rock, a lot more influence from blog rock, a lot more influence from sort of some of the more hipstery post-hardcore stuff. So yeah, there's a lot of that.
Menzingers.
Menzingers, yes. I did think of the Menzingers as well. Like at certain points, this reminded me a little bit of like After the Party and some of that sort of that era of Menzingers that I love so much. And so that's one attribute that really attracts me as well, that whole aesthetic of it. But the other thing is the concept behind this record as well, the thing that unifies these songs, which is that it is an album about growing up in amongst like real Bible Belt America. Essentially, it is an album that is very consistently about the experience of being raised within that whole world of heavy Christianity, essentially. And of course, it's not the first record, and certainly not even the first emo record to be about that, but it has this particularly modern twist on that as well, where it really addresses some of the attributes of American, Christianity that have risen to the forefront with the rise of things like mega churches. And there's even a song named after that on here as well. It is this particular vision of modern American Bible Belt Christianity and its complete ever increasing disconnect from reality, I suppose. And it's just such a potent and powerful expression of the frustration that comes from growing up within that and having your own independence be beaten away from you through that. It's a cheesy record at certain points as well. It's certainly a record that leans into these sorts of idealistic visions of escaping from that. But there's just so much in this record that I find really heartfelt, that I find really emotionally intense. There's lots of very premium emo lyricism that just is very hard on sleeve. There's a lyric that particularly struck me that feels like such a great little encapsulation of, being poor and having no real supports in the modern era, which is this lyric about like, I want to take you to the medical facility where they did experiments on me when I needed money.
Yeah.
Like particular experience that people who've been dirt poor and without good supports will, in the last few years specifically, will recognize, where it's become increasingly more and more common as a way of getting money, is just basically pimping yourself out as a lab rat, essentially. And that's something that I don't feel like I've heard mentioned just as an element of, you know, modern poverty that much. So that was just something that really, really struck a chord with me. And that's just, look, that's one of a multitude of things that really resonated on this album. And I think that Fireworks are a great band. I think that the album as well, if you don't want to listen to the full thing, I would highly recommend the single I Want to Start a Religion with You, which is, I think, like,
yes,
it's just such an anthemic,
very good song.
Brilliant. Like, I've listened to this song while walking to work. I've listened to the song while driving. I've listened to the song in the supermarket, and it feels like it lifts you up and transports you in the way that, you know, all great anthemic emo and pop punk songs should. So yeah, this album is certainly, I guess, having lack of competition doesn't mean very much, but it's my current album of the year. And I imagine it might be some time before it's dethroned. Could be wrong. Who knows? Either way, I think it's a great record. And I think that if you enjoy the sorts of things that I've mentioned, if you're looking for albums that do the sorts of things that I've mentioned, you should give this a shot. It's definitely flying under the radar. All the online reception it's gotten, apart from people who are really already heavily into this kind of emo, has been negative. So yeah, just give it a shot and see how you feel about it. Basically, either way, it's just nice to have the year kick off with such an affirming emo staple as well, particularly when, you know, I was starting to think that we wouldn't get a record like this again, since it's been basically 5 years now since Near My God, and this really feels like a spiritual successor to that. So yeah, that's my recommendations for the week.
Listen to that for songs like, if nothing else, for I Want to Start a Religion with You, Got Approved Insurance Plan, and Machines Kept You Alive. Those were 3 real highlights for me that I personally really enjoyed.
Yeah, it's there's a song on there called Jerking Off the Sky as well, which, above and beyond that just being a fucking fantastic title for a song about
I love that title. And I like Funeral Plant immediately preceding that. It reminds me of like a I don't know, like a flower growing out of some kind of pot, and it's got, I don't know, a spooky face, something like that.
There's loads of little things like that throughout the album. It's very modern emo. So yeah, I enjoy it.
Memo.
All right. Well, let's get to the meat of our now episode and talk about something that we've been building up towards, something that we've billed this episode as, which is our favorite films of 2022, films that have stood out to us. And to avoid this essentially going on forever, we're just going to limit it to 2 each. We're going to take it in turns to shout out films that we've loved from this year. Jake, I know that these 2 films that you're shouting out happen to be your top 2 films of the year. And I know that for myself and August, if not being our top 2, there's certainly films that we do that are highlights of the year for us in terms of what we've had a chance to actually check out. So Jake, why don't you lead us off first with your first pick?
My first pick here is my number 2 movie of the year, and it is, of course, how better to start off a list like this than a work from my favorite director, one Mr. Park Chan-wook. If you are at all familiar with cinema, I feel like Park Chan-wook's name has absolutely been on your radar because of the eternal classic movies like Old Boy, which is just, you know, a dorm room staple, one of those movies that everybody who gets into movies eventually watches, but a movie that I still admire for its incredible craft, its incredible performances. It introduced me to a world of Korean cinema that was really engaging and really unlike a lot of what I had seen at the time. And a lot of his movies are very idiosyncratic in a way you don't get in American cinema. So, of course, I was looking forward to Decision to Leave because his last movie, The Handmaiden, was also my favorite movie of its respective year. And The Handmaiden is just an immaculately crafted movie from all fronts. He's a guy whose the longevity throughout his career is absolutely astonishing. And nothing is more evident than that being still true with Decision to Leave, because this is a movie that is about 2.5 hours long, and it took me around 4 hours to watch it. And what I mean by that is that I just kind of had to at various points stop and process everything I was seeing, just because this is such a visual maximal overload of information. Every single scene, every single shot, every single blocking choice in this movie is fucking incredible. It is maximal. It is immensely stylized, to the point where I could see it alienating some viewers. But from somebody who just loves this kind of cinephilic porn, I ate this shit up. It's always in service of the greater emotions at play. It's never excessive or to the point where it alienates me as a viewer. It's always in service of what he's going for. And Decision to Leave is such an immaculately crafted movie that it's almost difficult to get past that exterior of like what the actual movie is about. But it is the story of a detective who is investigating a murder case who something is wrong with it. It's this guy who goes up, he's like a mountain climber, and he's eventually found dead, and they're trying to discover if there was a murder, in fact, if he just fell, and the prime suspect is this character's wife. And there's something suspicious going on here. Did she do it? Didn't she do it? Is she doing something else? And they're sort of a connection between the lead detective and this guy. It's very Hitchcock, very Vertigo inspired, lots of visual callbacks to stuff like that. And that main core relationship between the two lead performances is a lot of the magnetism and a lot of what is so appealing about this movie. I can't, of course, mention this without mentioning the sort of co-lead performance from actress Tang Wei, who is sensational in this movie, delivers one of the year's absolute best performances. I mean, debatably even the year's best performance in this movie, and just sort of plays that sort of typical kind of Hitchcock alternative heroine character with a new spin that I think is really interesting and really subversive. And this movie just goes in so many places that you don't initially expect, and it's filled with all of the hallmarks of Park's insanely stylized filmmaking. It is more like, it's not as intense as something like Old Boy or the second half of The Handmaiden. It is a bit more like normal comparatively, but everything it shows you, it feels like it's showing you in the most interesting way humanly possible. There is some editing choices in this, some match cuts, some fade shots that are just like, I have not stopped thinking about so many singular images from this movie. It just hasn't left my brain.
So this is also my second favorite film of the year. And I'll be honest, I've been a little bit obsessed with it ever since I saw it. Like, it's just one of those movies that has just taken up permanent residence in my brain and won't leave. Like, I think now there's a couple of blind spots. I've seen most of Park's films. The biggest blind spot is Joint Security Area, which I do plan to see very soon. So good. But from what I have seen so far, I think this is his best film. One of the things that might turn some people who have come towards him for stuff like Old Boy, for stuff like The Handmaiden, and for stuff like, was it Thirst? I can't remember his other movie.
Thirst, yes.
Yeah. For people who've become fans of Park for those kinds of much sort of gorier and more aggressive movies tonally, there might be a little bit less here that immediately appeals, just because this is such a moodier film. And also it's such a film that's so much more focused on the interiority of these characters' psychological experiences, particularly the protagonist. And it feels like, you know, every major filmmaker at some point, and sometimes multiple times in their career, makes their Vertigo. And this is absolutely like the latest iteration, and, you know, the endless amounts of Vertigos that we have basically from major filmmakers all the time. And this might be the best one yet, to be honest. This is an amazing film just in terms of the sheer density of information you're given, and the not necessarily the satisfying tightness with which it all kind of coalesces together, but just how satisfying it is to kind of start to resolve and rationale and deal with the information that you're given, figure out what's a red herring, figure out what isn't, while all at the same time the film never plays like a whodunit. The film never plays like a mystery to be wrapped up. It just plays as this sort of psychological character study. You talked about how difficult it can be to watch at certain points and how you kind of had to pause it a lot. The formalism of this movie is quite difficult to get used to if you're not really, prepared for it. Because one of the things that Park does, especially in the first half of this film, is that there's never any, like, if you actually look for them, there's never any clean scene transitions in the first half of this movie, and even in a lot of the second half of the movie as well. There's no establishing shots. There's no like clear settings. You just kind of end up moving from one location, moving from one place, both physically and emotionally, thematically, whatever, to another without any clear sense of the passage of time or the passage of space. And that creates this claustrophobia. You are completely inside this main character, this detective's head. You are never allowed to leave that space until the film sort of starts to widen a little bit. The narrative gets a little bit more, I think the film is great from start to finish. I definitely think the film is more locked in for the first half, and it has to, because of the demands of narrative, it has to do something and change a little bit, and the time has to pass and things have to get a little bit more complicated or whatever in the second half. And that's fine. It's done well. I do still think, though, the first half of this in particular is masterful. And the fact that you are so locked into this character's perspective and you completely lose track of time. There's extended periods of this where you might not see a certain character, or you might not, and after a certain time, you're like, oh shit, wait, what's happening? Where are we? What is actually going on here? And it's never unsatisfying.
It demands a lot of you.
It just completely engrosses you because you are essentially trying to piece together what is happening here and what is going to happen, and to what extent the answers to these questions are even meaningful or relevant. The experience of it as a psychological trip reminded me a lot of one of my other favorite films of the last 10 years, which is Lee Chang-dong's Burning, which has a similar structure and pacing to it as well. And the sense to which you're so embedded within the psychology of the lead character that it isn't until you've been in that for an hour plus, you start to realize how unreliable that space is. And it's just so satisfying in terms of the way that it progresses, as well as having, one of the most uniquely devastating endings of any film in the last 10 years.
I want to shout out Morgan, who isn't here, whose letterbox review for this is Park Chan-wook made approximately one movie where his characters got a happy ending, and that was The Handmaiden. And the rest is just like, if you are not in the mood to have a moodier, dreamlike, more devastatingly inclined ending, maybe don't watch this.
Tell you what, this movie it's Park doing Fincher doing Hitchcock. That's what it is.
Oh God.
Like, I was going to say, the procedural element's kind of like Zodiac. And I was like, no, but the kind of psychological procedural element's kind of more like Seven. But then there's also a little bit of like Gone Girl in there. And I was like, oh no, it's just the whole Fincher thing. He's just doing everything.
It's just Fincher's catalog, which again, my two favorite filmmakers are Park Chan-wook and David Fincher. So
yeah. And then like you realize, of course, that everything that Fincher does is just an attempt to do everything that Hitchcock did in the late 50s and early 60s.
It's the kind of movie that gets you excited about movies and the way that they are made. Like, if you are someone who is interested in the technical aspects of filmmaking, this is a must watch just to see what a maestro of cinema can do, who is at just the peak of his form. If you saw our favorite albums list, we kind of offhandedly mentioned how my favorite album and favorite movie of the year have basically a shockingly similar amount of qualities, both being both American Southern Gothic tales of cannibalism. So that narrows it down to my favorite movie of the year being Luca Guadagnino's Bones and All. If you're interested in what I have to say about the works of Luca Guadagnino, go check out our friend Zach's First Watch podcast, where we talk about the two Suspiria movies. If you have listened to that, you will know that I, of course, am an immense fan of Luca Guadagnino's disaster horror epic remake movie that was his last film. And that, of course, made me interested to see what he was going to do next. And of course, it ended up being a sort of synthesis of his last two projects, where he takes a kind of tragic romance and fuses it with a kind of high concept horror thing and adapts a novel. And Bones and All is, if I had to say what it's most similar to, it's probably Terrence Malick's Badlands, in that it is very much the story of this runaway couple that they just sort of go across America in this sort of, long protracted journey in various parts, and just kind of, it doesn't really have a through line narrative. It's just mostly an amalgamate of scenes, moments, discoveries, and from the outset is not a movie that everybody is going to get along with. That lack of narrative thrusts certainly I could see being a contentious point with many. It also, just generally speaking, like, it does have the overall sort of guiding light of the main character trying to find her mother, and then eventually meeting Timothée Chalamet's character. And it is a very formless movie, that is to be sure, and it is also just a very bizarre movie. It features a very odd performance from the likes of Mark Rylance, who shows up as a character named Sully, who is a cannibal along with our main character. And it sort of explores this kind of taboo nature of existence that's very analogous to, I think, at least like maybe the metaphor that the book was getting at, probably a little bit more concisely, was the AIDS crisis and what it was like to sort of live in that time period and just sort of exist as a sort of wayward soul who's just sort of trapped in this really innately tragic existence where you have to kill to survive. And there's just lots of interesting ways that they convey information about the specific way that they live. There's the central core romance at the center is really compelling and really, like, just very tangibly emotional. It's very well performed. I think all of the performances in it are fantastic. What the hell is that guy's name? He was in The Shape of Water. He shows up in this, and I think he even plays a character named Jake. What the hell is his name?
Michael Stuhlbarg, are you thinking?
Stuhlbarg. Yes, Michael Stuhlbarg shows up and plays a rednecked cannibal. You met Michael Stuhlbarg?
Yeah, I saw him at a screening of
Serious
A Serious
Man?
Man. Yeah, no, that's actually the movie
Holy
where I met
shit!
him. Yeah, my local theater was doing a screening and Q&A of that movie, so I gotta, meet him there and just basically say hi, and that was about it. But it was
thanks for making one of the best movies of the century.
I'm sure.
Yeah,
damn.
I'm sure that Fred Malamed can never go to those because people would just be shouting "Cy Abelman" at him.
Cy Abelman.
I fucked your wife, Larry. I seriously
fucked her.
Wouldn't that be awesome? Just watch that movie and just that movie's like the greatest thing ever made.
That may be the greatest film of
very
the
much
21st
is.
century.
Easy contender for it. That would make a hell of a double feature with White Noise.
Like, just talk about like the absolute meeting point and maximalist like realization of funny and profound. Like, there's not a single movie that's more funny and more profound than that movie.
And existentially horrifying.
It is, and it all does this while being, and it's the fucking Dubiak scene at the beginning is like my favorite thing ever.
If you take one thing away from this, it's that if you haven't seen the Coen Brothers' A Serious Man, you need to do that right now, because it's a movie that all three of us love.
Anyway, Michael Stuhlbarg shows up and
yes, he does. He does show up eventually, but it is sort of anchored to our two core leads, and it is like Riley's last pick, it features a banger end credits song from one Mr. Trent Reznor of Nine Inch Nails. The whole score, actually, I've listened to on its own. I would actually say is in the upper half of Trent Reznor's score work, which I listened to probably more than I'd care to admit, frankly. But I think a lot of it is that I find the content very compelling, very engaging. I love the way the narrative presented. I love the way it just kind of flows. I think it's beautifully shot, but it is a capture of a lot of my favorite aesthetic interests when it comes to film, when it comes to the sort of Southern Gothic style of this captures where I live in America better than like most movies I've ever seen. Like there are parts of it that are in fact is set in Kentucky. Timothy Chalamet's character is from Kentucky, but there are just parts of it that explore this kind of the places that you just don't often see, and if you do see, they're probably not very like flatteringly presented. Not that they are here, but it's just a lot of things that feel very familiar, very worn, very lovingly presented. Everything just feels like home. There's something very strangely comforting about a lot of this film, and that makes its disquieting horror elements stand out all the more, and that makes watching it a uniquely visceral experience, just because when it leans into the aspects that are like just insanely off-putting and just incredibly fucking gross, it has a way of introducing you to the elements of the taboo of the narrative that make you understand it, and it just creates this very, very compelling core dynamic of exploring an existence where there's just no way out for these people. There's no hope for them. They're living suspended in the dark forever until they die. And that kind of tragic nature just sort of infects every moment. But it's not a wholly sad or tragic picture. It just manages to encompass everything about stories that I find compelling and has so many uniquely wonderful scenes. It's maybe my favorite. It's up there in terms of like favorite movies of the decade. I'd say that this and Come On are probably front runners, but this has been the movie that has occupied the most of my brain since I've seen it, and that just has like gotten into me and, for lack of a better word, gnawed its way into my heart in a way that many movies just simply have not. Luca Guadagnino is a fascinating filmmaker and storyteller, and this is just another weird, wonderful entry into his very strange explorations of what other people would probably have like very well-trodden ground that feels very well-worn or maybe tried and true, but he makes feel wholly original, wholly unique, and just unlike anything you've ever seen. So I highly recommend this, but at the same time, I can't really highly recommend it to anybody in particular, just because it is a very idiosyncratic movie that's just, you know, if you don't vibe with it, you don't vibe with it. But holy fuck, did I vibe with it and cried a lot.
All right, so I'll kind of catapult into this with the one that I presume you two have seen, that being The Northman.
I actually haven't seen The Northman. But
oh shit, you have.
No, it's fine.
Oh wow.
Go ahead.
Well,
Okay.
I own The Northman, so I can double down.
Anyway, The Northman is the latest film from writer-director Roger Eggers, who I think in 2019 released The Lighthouse. The Northman is his latest film. It follows the story of Amleth, who is a young Viking prince whose uncle then usurps the throne from his father, killing him, sending Amleth on a basically lifelong quest for revenge against his uncle. This is, I believe, an adaptation of a fairly classic story in Norse mythology, and is, of course, the inspiration for Shakespeare's Hamlet. But a lot of what works about The Northman for me is that it is both a very atmospherically satisfying and intriguing film on its like technical levels, while also having a real visceral brutality to it in its combat and action. And also it's, of course, very beautifully shot, very well put together, well directed. It's Alexander Skarsgård in this. I love his performance here, along with Anya Taylor-Joy. This story here is mostly a very simple, kind of straightforward one, but the film also is well aware that you are aware of its very tried and true, predictable, dramatic stakes, and thus incorporates that predictability and fatalistic elements into kind of its narrative, its storytelling in a very clever and fun, punchy way that I really thought helped assuage some of my criticisms with this film. Granted, I think there are some sequences that feel a little more like video game boss fights than proper diegetic pieces of narrative. But as a whole, I think The Northman is just one of the most enthralling, both viscerally fun and punishing films of the year.
Beautiful.
This movie kicks fucking ass. I've seen it multiple times. I own it on Blu-ray. It's one of my favorite movies of the year as well. If honestly, this movie is worth it alone just to see what one of the great, like, modern, like, new indie directors does with a huge, big budget blockbuster sort of production, the scale of which is enormous. Like his last two movies, The Witch and The Lighthouse, are phenomenal movies. The Lighthouse in particular being one of my, like, all three of them are honestly three of my favorite movies of like the century so far. But like just seeing what he does on this scale is so interesting, and it does give you that kind of visceral sort of blood pumping kind of action blockbuster thing. But I think the cool thing about The Northman is that the second half of this movie, you get a lot more of a tactical mind game, kind of emotionally charged sort of narrative thrusts that feel a lot more in keeping with the character's interiority that maybe you weren't initially expecting. There's a lot of like late sort of heavy hitter performances, specifically from Nicole Kidman, who's fucking great in this and has an S-tier monologue at the very end. And I also agree with Augustin that I think the central performance, Skarsgård, is phenomenal. The physicality he brings to the performance, it's not like a traditionally great, like, emotive acting performance, but like there is a rawness and a sort of a strength and something that you don't traditionally maybe value in other movie performances, but just the way he inhabits this character physically, I think, is the most like interesting aspect of this performance. And it's just a great movie all around. It's an incredibly well-made film. If you're looking for some stellar cinematography and especially some great VFX work, when this movie tends to go in its more fantastical directions, it looks fantastic. Seeing it on a big screen was an absolute highlight of the year for me.
My second pick is going to be the wonderful new Hong Sang-soo film, The Novelists film. The film follows Kim Juni, an aging novelist who is growing increasingly disillusioned with her writing. So she travels out, gets out in Korea to experience things, feel something, just basically get out of being all cramped up. And this is very markedly a post-COVID film. We see a lot of COVID masks. There's talks of social distancing, social isolation, and basically within this quest into the broader expanses of the world, Junhee ends up meeting up with old friends, but particularly she meets up with young actress Kil-so, played by Kim Min-hee. And basically, when she meets up with Kim Min-hee, she just has this creative spark where she's like, we have to do a film together. Even though I am a novelist, I want to make a film with you. And essentially, this film is a large meta-narrative centered around Hong Sang-soo's obsession and just love of Kim Min-hee, as well as just some very beautiful, and it's kind of, yeah, just him using his characters as muses to vent his own frustrations with art, creativity, artistic drive, all sorts of things like that. And the film is shot in black and white. There's very beautiful shot compositions. The camera is mostly locked down in these kind of wider pulled back shots to really paint a portrait of the characters, their emotions, their expressions. The physicality of the performances becomes so much of a part of getting into this film's head, and yet it all feels so meticulous, so choreographed, so well blocked and planned out. And the ending, when we actually get to the titular novelist's film, once we kind of build to what that ends up being, it's a very beautiful, it's like stinging expression. It's exactly what you want. It's a satisfying, contemplative character piece that I found really stimulating on both just like an intellectual level and it's a fun, cozy experience. So the novelist's film gets my bid as something you should watch.
Right, well, my first pick for today's list is Noah Baumbach's adaptation of Don DeLillo's White Noise. This was a book that I read in my final senior year of high school as well for English class. It was a book that I was always kind of really captivated by. I was at a particular stage in my life as well that I think a lot of teenagers get to if you get really nerdy and into like, the canon and stuff, as you get really, really fascinated with and taken by, these massive sort of satirical postmodern takedowns of American materialism and the Reaganite 80s and all that sort of stuff. And White Noise is all of those things. And while I don't want to say I've grown off DeLillo's style somewhat in the years to come, it's not something that interests me as much now, although I have got his book Underworld glaring at me to read at some point in the near future. I still like White Noise as a book. I still think it's a really funny book. I still think it's a really sharp satire. And I still think that the distinct writing style of DeLillo, especially the way he writes dialogue in this like incredibly deliberately pretentious fashion that makes every single character seem like this walking alien, is something that Baumbach captures fantastically in this movie, which is, I will say, front to back, really fucking funny. Something that I don't think has been spoken about enough, because while people are like, talk about it as a satire, talk about it as this film that kind of makes fun of, the particular preoccupations of Reagan era Americans, this particular brand of materialism, but also this particular, the encroaching role of drugs and of prescription medication and of like this buy anything to solve your problem mentality that was pervasive in that era. And Baumbach has this really smart and funny way of capturing that and putting it into this story and through these characters that doesn't ever feel like he's kind of preaching to you about these things. And to be fair, DeLillo never did either, but it's just like these really amusing, very Robert Altman-esque sort of little capturings of that particular mindset. So of course you have Adam Driver as the lead character, who is of course the head of Hitler studies at his university, and that's kind of the famous
the head of Una.
And there's this great there's this hilarious scene, which is actually my favorite scene in the whole film, where Driver is giving this lecture essentially on Hitler studies and kind of talking about, Hitler's upbringing. And basically, I have no idea what the context for this is, and it's not really explained, but Don Cheadle, who's also a professor at the same university in Elvis studies, kind of wanders into this filmed lecture, and essentially Driver and Cheadle basically have a duel of words where they're basically just like trading off bits of like stories about the lives of Hitler and Elvis respectively, and they're kind of just going back and forth, and it's like shot and tonally it's like presented like a wrestling match or like a rap battle. Actually, it's presented like a rap battle essentially, but all they're doing is just lecturing. And that's just so emblematic of the sense of humor of DeLillo that Baumbach captures in his own very specific way. And you have every actor in this film, and particularly like Greta Gerwig's like very she's not paranoid, but she's just kind of like antsy and really anxious, and she has this particular sort of neurosis that doesn't really get dug into until the second half of the film, but she captures it so beautifully. And then you have these kids who are just like, the bit is that the kids are like, like 200 IQ intelligent and like speak in like Mensa level sentences and just bewilder the adults. And just the whole dynamic is just so funny. And of course, the conceit of the first half of the film, the airborne toxic incident, the way in which these incredibly neurotic and internally focused people in this very eclectic family respond to the potential imminent doom of a massive chemical spill in the neighboring rural area is just so hilarious. It's just every part of that whole airborne toxic event sequence is like basically verbatim how it appears in DeLillo's book, but just seeing it done in such a maximalist mile-a-minute dialogue way is just so funny. Especially just that continual like denial from Driver's character that the chemical spill is worth worrying about, even as, you know, the fucking media and the kids are just getting more and more freaked out, and the massive billowing cloud in the background is just getting bigger and bigger. It's almost like slapstick in a way. And then just the whole sequence where they flee town and it turns into this weird, like, I'm making this connection, I guess maybe because of the presence of Driver, who's tonally doing a similar kind of performance, but it does sort of remind me a little bit of Elios Carax's Annette, and the sort of just bizarre surrealist human vision of like, people don't talk like this and behave like this at all, but it's completely captivating. And of course, the directions the film goes in are super weird and super funny and super strange. There's this weird sequence where they're trying to escape this motorhome park where everyone is kind of convening because of their fear of the apocalypse, and it turns into this weird like National Lampoon mid-80s comedy thing where they're like they get trapped in a swamp, and it's just super bizarre. Nothing I can tell you about this movie if you haven't seen it will make any sense, but it's so much fun to watch. And it goes in so many different directions, and it's sprawling, and it does all this sort of stuff that doesn't really fit very well within the conventional bounds of a 2-hour movie, because the novel's kind of like that. But it's ridiculously entertaining. It's really, really funny. It has one of the greatest end credit sequences of recent memory, soundtracked to a fantastic new banger from LCD Sound System. It's a fucking amazing movie. I absolutely adore it. I have so much fun watching it. It deserves to be seen. You might not vibe with it, or you might have your own quirks or qualms or whatever, but you will not be bored at all. White Noise is a fantastically surreal vision of 80s America that in its own way ends up feeling kind of prophetic without being too on the nose about it. And also, it's just fucking awesome that this had Netflix money and that Baumbach was able to throw the budget he had at this, because for starters, you feel the budget, especially in the airborne toxic event sequence, which is like obviously incredibly expensive to produce. And it's just super awesome that this even exists. This is the kind of movie that feels like it could only exist in 70s or 80s American studio systems, where the money was there to be thrown at these kinds of bizarre artistic passion projects. It is so incongruous with the kind of filmmaking that's happening at the moment that it just has to be seen to be believed. And it's super fucking awesome that it exists. It's also, for the record, nothing like anything Noah Baumbach has ever done before. Like, in any respect, he's showcasing a formal chops here, and just a complete level of commitment to something so surreal and alien that shows an entirely new side of him as a director that I would have never imagined he could do. So yeah, that is my pick, first of all, is Noah Baumbach's incredible White Noise. My final pick for the day, which is my favorite film of 2022, saw it in the waning days of the year, which is kind of, to be fair, when it came out, but it was like, you know, for the longest time, I thought that my film of the year was actually going to be the Andrew Dominik documentary about Nick Cave. This much I know to be true, which I still think is, you know, in every respect, basically a masterpiece of envisioning the artist at work and them presenting their work, and helps that it's the later era work of Nick Cave. But anyway, that aside, I thought that was going to be a lock. Then again, I was like, you know, I actually haven't seen many films that have come out this year, so I'm not really in a position to say. But then this film came along at the end of the year, and I went to see it because it got really good reviews from people that I care about. Zach was praising it to high heavens. And of course, it was the Martin McDonagh film, The Banshees of Inisherin. And so I was like, okay, I have to see this. I've been up and down on McDonagh. over the years, I don't hate anything he's done like some people do, but I find him to be an author who definitely, as he creates and as he writes, he envisions his work very theatrically, and I haven't found that it's very consistently translated to compelling cinema. But I wanted to give this a shot because it marked a reuniting of Colin Farrell and Brendan Gleeson, who were last together in McDonagh's Fantastically Funny in Bruges. And so I was like, okay, I'm curious to see what McDonagh does with this pairing of actors again, both of them having been aged, relocating the setting of this, making it into something much more modest and sort of restrained in terms of just the locale and the setting, and everything about it seemed very much to be this much more intimate, character piece, as opposed to the broader comedy of his previous work. And I mean, this is just absolutely stunning. I mean, it is a very funny, very forthright, very perceptive, and very provocative film about, well, I mean, it's actually kind of hard to pin down it being about a single thing. On one hand, it is about the changing nature of friendships and human relationships, and why we even have friendships and relationships in the first place, what they give us on a mutual level and what they give us on an individual level, and how engaging in a friendship can be both an act of selflessness, an act of giving oneself to another person, but can also be an act of selfishness, an act of trying to find and maintain a sense of self-worth through the approval of someone else. So it's a film that asks really interesting questions about the ways in which we relate to other people and why we keep them in our lives versus why we maybe choose not to keep them in our lives. It's also a film that asks really interesting questions about the artistic process and about what an artist values, and whether or not an artist is willing to or should even put their work or put their dedication to what they do and what represents them ahead of other peripheral things in their lives. Is there a hierarchy of priorities for the artist? Should the artist put their art ahead of other aspects of their life, obligations, people, all these sorts of things? It's a film that asks really interesting questions about how the artistic process can be reconciled with the obligations of being a human being, essentially, and how you can have various different perspectives as an artist on how you go about that. And you can see on one side of the spectrum, an artist who feels as though for their work to be as good as it can be, and for it to mean as much as it can mean, and for their legacy to actually be created and to mean something, they need to be able to dedicate themselves wholeheartedly to that art and completely reject anything that they see as a distraction, including human relationships. So there's one side of the coin. There's the other side of the coin where you have Colin Farrell's character, who represents someone who feels that the character of Brendan Gleeson's concerns as an artist are misplaced and entirely selfish, and will ultimately not lead him to any sense of fulfillment, and ultimately also creates harm in the sense that it distances him from his friend and creates this rift that ultimately also leads to provocation in terms of Colin Farrell's own insecurities and weaknesses. And there's this great sense of these two characters pushing and pulling against each other with their own individual motivations that are both selfish and selfless. And it's a great story at the heart of it, with these two fantastic performances and this absolutely acerbically witty and ridiculously funny script that basically takes to its logical extreme this central conceit of the story of two people essentially who have different motivations in their lives and are looking for different things, or at least decide that they are, and basically takes that core character conceit and then basically takes it in this ridiculously extreme direction that kind of probes the psychology of these characters and takes it to these ridiculous extents. And to me, it's a beautiful and brilliant and fascinating and funny and incredibly provocative film that had me thinking about so many different things, and also at the same time just completely laughing my fucking ass off. I think McDonagh's a really funny writer, and that comes through in everything he does, but this I think is the funniest script he's written yet. And also is extra funny because he's found a way to marry what he's so good at in terms of writing and making his writing really humorous and witty and observational, and actually translating that to something that's formally both compelling and also like accentuating and elevating that comedy on the page. Right, McDonagh is so good at framing people. It's so good at directing particular expressions from people and deliveries and little subtle details like that that just make the film so much funnier. I think it's a masterpiece. It's not only McDonagh's best cinematic work, but a film that is so good. Like my other pick, like Noah Baumbach's White Noise, it's something that I never would have thought this creator, this filmmaker, this director, this artist had in them, and yet feels absolutely like the complete realization of all of their best strengths and a bunch that you didn't know they even had. You know, McDonagh's always kind of been talked down as a better writer than director, but here I think he just completely nails both things and finds a way to make something that is an airtight script, but also a complete visual and formal delight, and something that feels as though it has to exist in this format to have maximum impact. It's a masterpiece. Banshees of Inisherin, go and see it if you haven't already. Even if you're not interested in these thematic things that I've talked about, it's a movie that will have you laughing. I saw it in a packed theater, and just hearing and being in this space with people who are having this response and laughing at these moments to these very just like dry wit things. That's the other thing as well. The particular dry wit of Ireland and of McDonagh is very not actually dissimilar to the dry wit of people here in New Zealand as well. So it's like, it just feels very like, you know, it feels just, I'm very primed to get what McDonagh's doing. But yeah, I think it's the best film of the year by far. I can't wait to watch it again. There's like some films that are funny. You get little lines of dialogue in your head and you're just laughing at them about them for, you know, weeks on end. And some films that are funny, you have that, plus you just have micro expressions and little shots and moments and things that just make you just completely just fall apart. And I mean, one of the things that's dominated discourse around this movie is, oh, it's been nominated for all these musical or comedy Golden Globe, but it's actually a really, really sad movie. Yeah, it's emotional in every sense. Like, it is a movie about the inextricable link between tragedy and comedy, right? How each comes from the other and relies upon the other for impact. And yeah, the tragic is hilarious. The funny is tragic, and everything about it is complicated and truly reflective of how the way we experience these things is not simple or distinct or two-dimensional. And I'm sorry, like, if that's confusing to you because we don't have many films that nail it like this one does, I guess. But yeah, it is just a fucking fantastic film.
McDonagh is kind of the working master of that. I agree with pretty much everything you said. This is one of my favorite movies of the year as well. And I mean, if anything, see it for an amazing Colin Farrell performance. He's an actor I really, really love. And this is probably his best work alongside In Bruges. And not to mention, I think this is, as a bigger McDonagh fan than you, I probably think this is McDonagh's best movie too. And I think one of the images that has stayed with me the most this year is that the first time you see Colin Farrell in this movie, he's walking towards the camera in this shot that has like a rainbow in the background, and he's smiling, and you just know deep down, you're just like, oh, fuck, here we go. Like, he's fucked.
Yeah. And just the directions that it goes, like, you get an idea of tonally and maybe even a little bit thematically, and you get an idea of where the film is going to go because it sets you up in a certain way, but it does a great way of going about that way in a way that feels completely alien to what you expected.
You will never hear the word feck in a movie more than this. No one says fuck, it's feck every single time. It's
aggressively Irish. And I was just saying, like, one of the things I wrote in my letterbox capsule is like,
the main character's name is Padraig
and Colum. The thing is, like, if you watch this at home, if you're like me, I'm one of those people, I know that I think Jake, at very least you are as well. We always watch movies with subtitles on, just because
I need subtitles for this movie.
Yes,
you absolutely need them.
You do need them, but I kind of encourage you to watch it without them, because I feel like kind of not being able to understand what they're saying all the time almost heightens the experience. You just have these aggressively Irish men being frustrated with each other. And there's something about not always picking up on everything that makes that kind of illegible frustration even funnier. But yeah, watch it with or without subtitle. Do whatever you want. Just watch it. It's a fucking masterpiece. One of the best movies I've seen in the last several years. Okay, well, that brings us to the end of this incredibly overlong and ridiculous now episode. Thank you for sticking with us. Let us know what your favorite films of 2022 were, what you thought of our picks as well, what you thought of the music and music news and records that we shouted out today as well. We want to hear from you in the comments below, or if you're listening over on Spotify or Apple, you can head on over to the link in the description to leave us a comment there. If you enjoyed this, please consider giving it a like and subscribing if you haven't already. Both those things help us a lot. Welcome to all our new subscribers, of course. Consider, if you have not already as well, if you want to support us directly, you can hit the join button. And for just $1 a month, you can support us directly, get your name in every video. And if you want to recommend us something to listen to or talk about, it will go to the top of the pile. August, send us home.
As always, folks, rock over London, rock on Chicago. Citibank, the city never sleeps.